always, I'll be recording us going through the notes tonight, and we'll be posting the recording up on the Google Classroom once it gets all processed and uploaded. So obviously this is Thursday, so it is the last Zoom call of our week for week 7. And the immune system is going to be the last major body system that we cover. We're not going to be covering any new material in week 8 because week 8 is when the final exam for this class is going to post. So I haven't 100% completed it yet. It should be done by Friday, and it'll be posted at the beginning of the day on Monday. So just like with your midterm, you'll have all week to finish the final. It's not due until the end of the night next Thursday. And it has not only information from the last couple systems we've talked about, the immune, the skeletal, muscular, and excretory, but it also has some questions on it that reach all the way back to the beginning of the semester, from the digestive system to the circulatory system and all of those guys. And so in week 8, instead of going over new material and trying to cram that in while you guys are also working on your final at the same time, instead, we're just going to be reviewing some of our old material, kind of doing a greatest hits on some of the important stuff from the last 7 weeks, and answering any questions that you guys have that could potentially help you with some of the information on the final. So there will still be the daily participation questions just so that you can get marked for attendance on the days we don't have Zoom. But there's not going to be any new notes or new material that we go over in week 8. We're just going to be reviewing stuff to help you guys with the final, which again will be posted Monday morning, but is not due until Thursday evening. So you have the entirety of week 8, Monday through Thursday, to work on it. Speaking of Thursday, next Thursday, October 22nd, is the last day that you guys will be able to turn in grades or turn in material for this class. So if there are any worksheets that you still haven't finished up or any work in the next day or two that you don't quite get to, make sure everything that you can possibly get turned in is turned in by the end of the day on Thursday, October 27th. I'm not able to accept any work after that day since that's the last day of the term. And so any assignments that you don't have turned in by Thursday, October 22nd will be posted as zeros in the grade book and could significantly hurt your grade, especially if you have more than a few of them stacking up. So my goal is on Friday to send out email to students who are still missing work, giving you kind of a heads up on which worksheets that you're still missing and have to complete for the 22nd if you want to earn the points for those assignments. So again, we're going over some more information on the immune system today. Then the final exam is going to be posted at the start of next week, and we're going to be spending our in-person Zoom classes next week going over some of our old material and getting kind of everybody caught up on all of the different body systems before the final is due. Any questions on what's going to be happening in the next couple weeks in anatomy class? Alrighty, so if not, then we can go ahead and get into the notes. So today we're going to be talking about the immune system again, and we're going to be going a little bit deeper into a couple different aspects of the immune system that we didn't quite get to yesterday. So we're going to be talking more about the differences between viruses and bacteria that give us disease. We're going to be talking a little bit more about some of the ways that your body uses to fight off diseases like fever and inflammation. and how some of those T cells work with the antibodies in order to recognize different types of foreign invaders. And then also, we're going to talk a little bit more about vaccines and antibiotics and how those work in order to fight off infections with your body. So you wake up one morning and you're feeling kind of yucky. You've got a stuffy nose, a little bit of a fever, and fatigue. And so people ask you, oh, how are you doing? You don't look so great. Do you say, oh, I think I've got the flu? Or do you say, oh, I've got like the common cold? Is it the same thing? Are they different things? Should you go to the doctor? If you go, will giving you an antibiotic help or won't it? So all of these things have to do with the different ways that our body gets infected and the different types of infections that we have to deal with. So a cold, or the common cold that you get that makes you a little bit stuffy, maybe a slight fever, you just kind of feel crappy for a couple days. It doesn't really do any lasting damage. It just sucks to have. It is a type of infection caused by a type of virus called a rhinovirus. So a rhinovirus gets into your respiratory tract and irritates some of those mucous membranes, which is why you become like a little bit coughy, sneezy, kind of yucky feeling. And so you might be thinking, well, I get the cold like a couple times a year. And Mr. Stanley, you said that last week that if you get a disease once, then you make antibodies for it, and so you can fight it off more easily the second time. This is true. Unfortunately, there are over 100 different types of rhinoviruses that all cause the same basic symptoms. So that's the reason why we're not able to develop like a vaccine or a good treatment for the common cold, because all of these viruses are slightly different from one another, enough to the point that each time they get into your body, they look like a new disease. So you have to make new antibodies for this slightly different rhinovirus. So the rhinovirus, the influenza or the flu, the coronavirus, as you might suggest, are all viruses, which we talked a little bit about last time. So Matt asked that question about, are viruses alive or not alive? Technically, according to science, they are non-living particles, but they do contain genetic material like DNA or RNA, those nucleic acids, and they hijack your cells in order to reproduce. So last time we talked about how they get into your cells, make thousands of copies of themselves, and then cause your cell to explode and send a little virus particles all throughout your body. Viruses cannot be killed or treated with antibiotics. The reason for that is that antibiotics treat bacteria. And viruses are not bacteria. They're a different type of particle. So you can't take antibiotics to get over the flu or to get over a cold or to get over even the coronavirus, because those are viruses and antibiotics do not work against viruses. They work against bacteria. Bacteria, unlike viruses, they are living organisms. They are a type of living thing. So they produce energy, they reproduce, and they have DNA. And so things like E. coli or Streptococcus are little single-celled living organisms that, if given the opportunity, will try to infect your body, not by taking over and hijacking your cells, but just by growing and reproducing on their own within your tissues. So bacteria can be targeted and killed by antibiotics, because antibiotics are specific medicines that target different parts of the bacteria, like the cell wall, the kind of covering that goes around the bacteria, that viruses do not have. So viruses are so small and simple, it's really hard to develop drugs that are able to attack them. Bacteria, however, have larger structures that are more easily able to be defeated and destroyed. So antibiotics, good against bacteria, useless against viruses. Because again, they both give you infections, but they infect you in different ways. All right, so we talked somewhat about our different body defenses last time. And so we talked about those 3 different layers of defense, right? We have our first level, which in this little picture is called a non-specific external barrier. That just means first level defense. So things like your skin, your cilia, your mucus, your stomach acid, all those are there to try and prevent these viruses and bacteria from getting in your body. If we do get past that level, then we have the second stage, that innate immune response, that cell-mediated response of the T cells and the phagocytes and stuff like that, attacking these cells, trying to destroy and kill them. And if those guys aren't able to do the job done, that's when we attack them with our active immunity. So we produce those antibodies, which are able to recognize and clump up against the diseases, which make it easier for our white blood cells to find and kill them. So we talked a lot yesterday about our first line of defense, things like skin, mucus. Ooh, this isn't right. There's an error on this slide. Phagocytes go on a different level. So things like skin, mucus, stomach acid. So no, pay attention to that. That's on the wrong slide. Stomach acid are all there to try and prevent viruses and bacteria from getting into our system. So they don't really attack things or kill the cells. They're just, well, the stomach acid will kind of break them down. They're just there to try and keep the stuff out. So failing that, we have some of our kind of second level defenses. So things like inflammation, which again is caused by histamines, which are released when cells get damaged. So when cells are damaged, they release histamines, which causes blood and fluids to collect around an injury to not only help white blood cells get there faster by increasing the blood flow, but it also tries to dilute any toxins that might be entering your body while you have this injury, maybe like an open sore or cut that's open to the outside world. So that's why that area swells, because all of a sudden there's a whole bunch more fluid underneath your skin in that location than normally would be there. It can also cause the temperature to rise slightly, which may kill certain microbes which are really sensitive to changes in temperature. That's also why when you get sick, you also tend to run a fever. So we can have not just a localized fever, but also a whole body fever, right? You feel hot and yucky, you take your temperature and you're at like 99 or 100 degrees. And it seems counterproductive, right? You get a fever and you feel worse, you feel more sick. And in fact, if your fever goes on for too long, it can actually start damaging your body. So why in the world would we ever want to have a fever when we are infected? Well, just like I was saying earlier, when you have a fever and it raises your body temperature, that can destroy a lot of different types of microbes that are infecting you. So a lot of these bacteria and viruses are super duper sensitive to changes in temperature, making it just half a degree or 1 degree above their ideal temperature can dramatically reduce their ability to infect human cells. So fever actually does help kill off a lot of the microbes that might be entering your body during an infection. Obviously, sometimes your body, if your infection goes on too long, the fever gets worse, and that can actually start causing internal damage to your body and to your cells. If you have a low fever, it just indicates that your body is trying to get rid of an infection. And some doctors will even recommend not even taking any like cold medicine or any ibuprofen or anything like that, just letting the fever run its course to naturally kill off the microbes that are trying to infect you. So we have some sort of damage in our skin. When our cells get wounded, they release histamine. Histamine causes increased blood flow to help bring some of our white blood cells closer to the infection. And so when they do get there, some of them, like our phagocytes here, will enter the tissue and start trying to engulf and destroy all these little bacteria that are infecting the wound. So as a result of this increased blood flow and increased white blood cell count, the skin is going to get inflamed and swell up, and also might run a slight bit of a fever to try and help the white blood cells kill off all those little microbes. So instead of, as part of our next lines of defenses, we can have those white blood cells that just attack and kill any sort of foreign cell that comes in. But we also have ways of defending ourselves against specific diseases, granting ourselves immunity against certain diseases. So we've talked about some of these guys before. Like we talked a lot about T cells last week, how they help to attack infected human cells, and antibodies, which are able to recognize those antigens, so those little proteins that the bacteria or the virus might be showing. We talked a little bit about B cells last time, but we'll talk a little bit more about them today. Essentially, they're what help make our antibodies. And then macrophages are essentially just another type of white blood cell. So the tricky thing about the immune system for a lot of students is that there are some very similar words that mean somewhat different things. So a lot of these words are related to each other, but they all mean something different. And sometimes it can be hard to keep track of which is which. So before we get too far in it, I figure it's good to review some of this stuff. So antibodies, we talked about last time. Those are those guys that are kind of shaped like a big Y. So antibodies are what are produced by us that help to tag and destroy invading microbes. So they are able to recognize different types of viruses and bacteria that might be floating around and trying to infect our system. Antibiotics are the medicines that we use in order to kill bacteria. We actually get a lot of the chemical structure for these antibiotics from different microbes in the soil that they normally use them in order to kill off some of their competition, but we use them to kill off the bacteria that try to infect us. And then finally, antigens are the proteins that are recognized by antibodies. So these guys are very closely linked together. And they are what the body uses to recognize self versus non-self. So for example, all of the cells in my body have basically the Mr. Stanley antigen on them, right? My immune system can recognize all my muscle cells and blood cells and heart cells and stomach cells as, yes, these are Mr. Stanley cells. They have the Mr. Stanley antigen. And so we are fine with these cells being around in the body. This is where they're supposed to be. However, those invading microbes have different antigens. So they have not Mr. Stanley antigen. They have E. coli antigens or rhinovirus antigens or coronavirus antigens. So our immune system recognizes those as not ourself. Those are not supposed to be in our body. So our immune system with our antibodies will recognize and attack invaders that have this not self antigen. Anything else, any of those other little protein bits that indicate that that is not part of your body. So antibiotics are what we use to kill bacteria. Antibodies are proteins that we make that circulate in our blood and recognize different types of cells. And antigens are what the antibodies are recognizing. So we produce specific antibodies for all of the different antigens, all of the different not self antigens that our immune system comes across over the course of our lifetime. All right, so before we move on, any questions so far on antibodies versus antigens or anything else with the immune system? All right. So for a little bit more visual description of our antibodies and antigens, here is a super zoomed in cartoon or graphic design version of an antibody. So it has that Y shape due to these different protein chains that make it up. And each antigen or each antibody recognizes a specific antigen. So the way that these protein chains are assembled, they can be tweaked slightly to recognize different antigens. So for example, this antibody is able to recognize this antigen because it has a spot that lines up perfectly with the antigen. So on one side, it's got the little wide point and the wide bump, and on the other side, it's got the super narrow bump and the super narrow point. And so this antibody is able to recognize and bind and stick to this specific type of antigen. So that's why we're able to have tons of different types of antibodies looking for the antigens of different diseases, is because they're able to be customized for each disease. So antibodies can be used in a couple different ways. Some antibodies remain attached to a big immune system cell called a B cell, which we'll talk about in a little bit more in a little bit. And they're able to kind of stay attached to that cell and help that cell recognize if it comes into contact with a foreign microbe. So they act as little receptors for our B cell. Some of them can act as receptors for our B cells and help send the signal quickly to the B cell that, hey, we've got a foreign microbe here and I know what it is. My antibody recognizes the little antigen on this microbe. Antigens can, or see, even if I mess it up, antibodies can also float around our immune system and bind to these antigens. So these microbes are floating around, hoping to cause trouble and cause an infection. And if our antibodies recognize the microbe, then a whole bunch of them will gang up and clump up around the microbe. So they tag the microbe. This essentially is a signal to any of those phagocytes or other white blood cells that are nearby to help them say, hey, guys, here's something that needs to be destroyed. Here's something that we need to wipe out. So they're not attached to any specific cell. They're just kind of floating around until they make contact with the correct antigen on the specific microbe. So when you get a whole bunch of antibodies attached to an antigen, it can slow down that microbe, it can make it harder for it to carry out its life functions, and it can serve as a signal for other white blood cells to come along and attack and kill that microbe. So some antibodies hang out on cells and send the signal to the cell that there's an infection going on. Some antibodies float around on their own and clump up around microbes that they recognize in order to slow them down and make it easier for the white blood cells to finish them off. So again, we use the antigens on cells in order to recognize if they are part of our body or not part of our body. So one of the cool ways that this can work is if a macrophage, like one of those phagocytes, like a big white blood cell, encounters some unknown antigen that it doesn't recognize, it'll bring that antigen to a T cell. So it'll find a nearby T cell and essentially say, hey, is this supposed to be here? I don't think this is right. And the T cell, if it recognizes it as not a Mr. Stanley antigen, will say, you're right, that is a foreign invader, that is an infection that got in here, and it'll help to launch an immune response. So besides the T cells that we talked about last time that just attack and kill the foreign cells, there are also T cells called helper T cells, which help the body to recognize different antigens. So they're used to kind of communicate with our other white blood cells if there's an issue with recognizing different types of antigens. So just kind of a cool way that the different cells work together. So these helper T cells can recognize those antigens, and if they recognize a foreign antigen, an invader antigen, they can send a signal to the B cells to help them divide to create more B cells, which are the guys that help make our antibodies. So if the T cell recognizes an invader, it'll help get more antibodies in the system by getting the B cells to make a whole bunch of copies of themselves. So that's why diseases like AIDS are so brutal for the immune system, is that the HIV virus attacks T cells. And so when your helper T cell count goes way down, it's hard to mount this immune response. It takes it a much longer time for the body to recognize when there is an infection occurring. So B cells, there's a couple different types of B cells that we're not really going to super get into today. But the main thing about B cells is that they produce our antibodies. So B cells have all sorts of different antibodies, and in general, one type of B cell will make one type of antibody. So there's usually thousands of different types of B cells floating through your immune system at any given time. And so if the antibodies on a B cell recognize an invader, recognize a specific antigen of, like, say, E. coli bacteria, that will stimulate that B cell to reproduce and make lots more of that type of antibody. Since those are the antibodies that we need to help fight the infection, this B cell, when it recognizes an infection, is stimulated to reproduce and make lots of antibodies to help us fight off that foreign microbe that's getting in there. So B cells make antibodies, and they're stimulated to make antibodies when they recognize a specific antigen. When those little antibodies that are on the surface of the B cell so when these guys recognize a specific microbe, it'll trigger the B cell to divide and make lots and lots more of these specific antibodies. And then, like we mentioned earlier, those antibodies, when they're freely roaming around in the blood, they bind to their specific antigen. So remember, one type of antibody goes with one type of antigen. So we make lots and lots and lots of different antibodies because there are lots of different invader antigens that we're going to come in contact with over the course of our lifetime. So whenever an antibody encounters an antigen, it'll bind to it. And if you get a lot of antibodies binding to the same microbe, you might just completely shut it down. You could cause a whole bunch of them to stick together so that they're less able to move throughout our body. And they signal white blood cells. It makes it easier to recognize and destroy microbes that are surrounded in all of these antibodies. So I mentioned the helper T cells earlier that can help recognize different types of antigens that white blood cells come into contact with. There's also the kind of T cells that we talked about yesterday, which are the killer T cells. And so those are the ones that'll seek out and destroy the antigens, some of the antigens that we're recognizing that are invading. So just like those phagocytes and other white blood cells, they can destroy those microbes that are tagged by the antibodies and surrounded by them. They can also help to recognize infected human cells. So human cells that are being filled up with virus or certain types of cancer cells. These T cells can help recognize that this cell, it may have started as a Mr. Stanley cell, but something is going wrong with it right now and it needs to be taken out. So the B cells produce the antibodies. The T cells can either help recognize antigens if they're a helper T, or destroy microbes and human cells if they're a killer T. So here's sort of a big chart of all the different types of immune system cells there are. It goes into a little bit too much detail for the stuff that we've been talking about. But you've got your phagocyte or your macrophage as sort of like your basic white blood cell. Then you've got the helper Ts and the B cells, which help to recognize the antigens on different microbes. And we've got our cytotoxic or our killer Ts, which help to fight off infected cells, including infected human body cells, which is what's going on down here. So that is all the ways that the human immune system works on its own in order to help us fight off an infection. I know it was a whole bunch of different types of cells that I threw at you, but I just try to give you sort of the basics of each one. Are there any more questions on antigens, antibodies, B cells, or T cells? Alrighty. So I talked about this a little bit on Tuesday, but I wanted to go into a little bit more detail on a couple aspects of it, and that is human-assisted immunity. So ways that we have developed as humans studying the human body in order to help us fight off infections using science and medicine. So we've talked about these in a little bit of detail before, but now we're going to talk a little bit more about them. So there's a couple different major ways that we have to fight off infections. We have antibiotics, which, as we mentioned earlier, can fight bacterial infections, which are not the same as antibodies, even though it's a very similar word. So antibiotics are medicine that fight bacteria. Then we also have vaccines that we have developed that can also help us to fight off both viruses and bacteria. So antibiotics, again, only work against bacteria, not viruses. So there are a whole bunch of different ways that antibiotics help to slow down or kill bacterial infections. They can interfere with bacterial reproduction, so extremely slowing down the rate of bacteria reproducing and making more copies of themselves. They can also interfere with bacteria making what's called a cell wall. So a lot of bacteria are covered by a protective coating called a cell wall that makes it difficult for the killer T cells and for the phagocytes to attack and destroy them. Antibiotics can rupture and destroy parts of the bacterial cell wall, which makes it much easier for our immune system to get in and kill the bacteria. So by interfering with sort of the normal life cycle of the bacteria, they can slow down and help our body stop bacterial infections. Again, antibiotics, medicine that we take to kill off bacteria, but not viruses. So antibiotics are not antibodies. Again, antibodies are those little Y-shaped proteins that humans make. Antibiotics are other proteins and structures that we produce in our medicine that is derived from other single-celled organisms that humans have discovered over the years. Antibiotics do not hurt our immune system. So some people think that your immune system won't be as good if you take antibiotics. That is not true. They have no direct effect on our immune system. They help our immune system by weakening or killing the bacteria that are infecting us. So you may have heard some things in the news about antibiotic resistance. It does not mean that humans are becoming immune to antibiotics. Instead, it means that the antibiotics may not destroy all the different types of bacteria that we come across. There are some bacteria out there that are naturally antibiotic resistant, and there are some bacteria that have been treated with antibiotics by humans for so long that they're actually starting to become resistant to those antibiotics. It's just like how there's some pests in farmers' fields that have become resistant to different types of pesticides. There are some bacteria that are becoming more and more resistant to the typical antibiotics that we use to help kill them. So that's what is meant by antibiotic resistance. The other major way that humans try to help boost our immune system to fight off diseases is vaccination. So vaccines in one form or another have actually been around for a really long time. So there's a term called, from back in centuries ago in Asia or Africa, called variolation, where smallpox was an extremely deadly disease for most of human history. It was an extremely infectious and terrible disease that would cause you to break out in these awful blisters and sores, which would turn into these pock marks on your skin. And a long time ago, some people discovered that if you took some smallpox sores and dried them out and rubbed them on your skin, especially places where your skin was broken, it would potentially give you smallpox, but also potentially help keep you safe from future smallpox. So that was sort of one of the ideas for how vaccines got started. But where they really came from was Edward Jenner in 1796. And if you know your Latin or your Spanish, you might know that the word vaca is cow. It's the same thing in Latin and Spanish. I think Spanish is VACA, Latin is VACCA. But the reason why the word for vaccine is derived from the word for cow is because smallpox was still a big deal in the late 1700s. But this one physician, Edward Jenner, noticed that certain dairy maids who were essentially farm workers that worked on dairy farms would get cowpox, which is a variant of smallpox that, as you might suggest, people can catch from cows, but it's much less deadly and much easier for the human immune system to fight off. Dr. Jenner realized that these maids who got cowpox would then never in their lifetime be infected with smallpox. And so he thought that maybe if you get cowpox early in your life, it'll help protect you later from smallpox. So he inoculated a young boy on a farm with secretions from cowpox sores. So essentially the cowpox virus he injected into a boy, and then did experiments and studies to prove that the boy was then immune from smallpox. His body was able to recognize and fight off the smallpox virus, while millions of other people around the world were dying from it every year. So this is credited as the first case of vaccination. So now you know that the reason it's called a vaccine is based on the cow or the vaca. So by taking a similar virus and injecting it in somebody that their body was easy to fight off, they then were immune from future infections from a very similar virus. So even back then, there was controversies around vaccines, which, when you think about it, kind of makes sense. Here's this guy saying that, oh, if you just inject yourself with this disease, then you'll be fine from smallpox, which sounds kind of crazy if you're a layperson in the late 1700s, early 1800s. There's this person who's supposed to be a doctor that's telling you that you should get injected with diseases. So people were understandably a little freaked out by it, even back then. So modern vaccines, we don't just take one type of virus and hope that it protects you from a similar type of virus. Instead, they're extremely well tailored for specific viruses and bacteria. So we either have dead bacterial or dead virus vaccines where we have bacteria and viruses that we have killed off and then collect those dead microbes and inject them into somebody. They're dead, so they can't cause any further issues, but those antigens are still there. So your body is able to produce antibodies for those antigens that can then recognize that disease again in the future. We can also have so-called live virus vaccines, which are not actually live versions of the virus. It's essentially fragments from these microbes. So it's like we've taken the microbes and blended them all up and kind of scattered them into pieces and then inject you with those pieces. Those pieces still have the antigens and are still able to be recognized by our immune system. And now we have those B cells in place to produce the correct antibodies should that disease, should that illness encounter us once again. So by getting a vaccine, you're getting a killed or destroyed version of the bacteria or virus. Your body will mount an immune response because it'll recognize it as something foreign, but more importantly, it'll start creating antibodies that specifically recognize that bacteria or that virus, so that should you ever get infected with those bacterial or viral particles again, your body can immediately go to work attacking and destroying them. And that's what helps give you immunity from that for the next 5 years to 10 years to life, depending on the vaccine that it is. So unfortunately, there are a lot of myths around vaccines these days, which is a big shame from a scientific standpoint, because vaccines are one of the greatest human inventions of all time. So the flu vaccine will not give you the flu. This drives me, and especially, so my wife is actually a virologist. She studied viruses when she was going to grad school, and it drives both of us crazy when people are like, well, I don't want to give the flu vaccine because I got it one year and sure enough, it gave me the flu that year. The flu vaccine does not give you the flu. You might feel a little under the weather the day after you get the vaccine. That's just because your body is fighting off those dead particles. You may feel crappy at some point after you get the vaccine. That could be from a cold, those rhinoviruses that we were talking about earlier, which is different than the flu. Some people get the vaccine too late. So they get it when they already have come into contact with somebody who had the flu. So their body is already fighting off the flu when they get the vaccine. Or they might get the flu even if they get the vaccine, but that's because there are usually multiple flu strains in circulation. So not quite as many as the rhinoviruses. There's not hundreds, but there's usually a certain number, and we can only vaccinate against 3 or 4 flu strains at a time. So there's a lot of work that goes in each year into determining which flu vaccines we need to produce. So it is still possible to get the flu, even if you get the flu shot every year, but there are a whole lot of factors, and it does protect you against the vast majority of the most common flu strains that are out there. Vaccines are not less effective than naturally getting the illness and allowing it to pass through you. You're going to produce the same antibodies, whether or not you get a dead virus injected into you or you catch a live virus from somebody else. And it's much less risky to have a mild response to a vaccine than a full-blown infection of things like, I don't know, measles, polio, smallpox. All of those are potentially deadly diseases, whereas the vaccine might cause you to get the sniffles for a couple days. And then finally, there was an infamous paper that falsely claimed that vaccines can lead to autism. This has since been thoroughly debunked, and in fact, the person who originally wrote the paper has had their medical license revoked because it was such a poorly conceived and poorly written paper about it. So there is essentially no experimental support for the idea that vaccines can lead to autism. It is true that some people, in extremely rare cases, usually less than 1% of people, could have a strong allergic reaction to a vaccine. So remember, we talked about allergies being your immune system going into overdrive for things that aren't that serious. And in very rare cases, people can have severe reactions to vaccines, but for over 99% of people, vaccines are perfectly safe and extremely effective at saving lives. So some of the different things that sometimes people get kind of challenged when they talk or they think about the immune system. And some of the stuff we've already talked about is when people are like, well, why can't they come up with a cure for the cold? Or why is it that you say I'm producing these antibodies, but I get the cold every year? Again, there's over 100 different known rhinoviruses. So even if you catch the cold 70 times, there still could be 30 different cold viruses out there. Also, cold virus, the rhinovirus, is known to mutate extremely quickly. So there are 100 different ones now, but over the next few years, there could be dozens of more different rhinoviruses that have mutated from the original strains. And so it's almost impossible for you to have caught and developed antibodies for all these different types of viruses. So sometimes people claim that they have a stomach flu, which isn't exactly correct. So the influenza is a respiratory virus. The influenza virus attacks the cells in your respiratory tract. There is not a type of influenza that attacks your stomach. There are stomach viruses, things like norovirus and rotavirus can cause extreme nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea that can come along with being attacked by these viruses. Normally, they're over pretty quickly within 1 or 2 days. I know one of my worst experiences recently was last year. My wife and I had dinner at my parents' one night, and then we came back home. And then over the course of the night, I ended up throwing up 6 times in about 3 or 4 hours, which was pretty brutal. And so I went to the urgent care clinic in the morning, and the doctor was like, oh yeah, it's the stomach virus. It's been going around. Take these anti-nausea medications for the next day, and in 24 hours, you should be pretty much back to normal. And I was. It comes in, hits hard, but your immune system is able to take care of it pretty quickly. You can also get food poisoning from bacteria in your food. So if your meat isn't cooked properly or your fruit and veggies haven't been washed properly, then the bacteria that grow on them can potentially infect you and give you these nasty symptoms. All right, some other myths out there are there's a ton of products that are jam-packed full of vitamin C and claim that they'll boost your immune system and help you get over your current disease lickety-split. And so vitamin C is an important vitamin for your body. It makes a couple different structural proteins and other stuff. And you can absorb slightly more vitamin C when you're sick, and it has a tiny effect on some of the histamines that you produce when you get injured or ill. Vitamin C itself isn't really an immune booster. It's not going to help you cure your cold. And a lot of times, if you take, like, some pills give you like 300% of your daily value of vitamin C, you're just going to be peeing most of that out. That's one of those vitamins that will get pulled out during filtration when you go through the excretory system, and you're just going to pee out most of the vitamin C you take in anyways. So it may support some minor aspects of your immune system, but it's not like the immune superfood, superpower that some ads would claim it is. Same thing for zinc. There's some studies that show that a slight amount of zinc could potentially help lessen some of the impacts from things like rhinoviruses. So there are some, like cough drops and stuff, that will have a little bit of zinc in them. But it is possible to get too much zinc in your system. You don't want to be taking like straight zinc supplements. I don't even know if they sell those, but if they do, I would recommend against it. If too much of it can actually end up suppressing the immune system. And if you get it in your nose, it can destroy some of your olfactory receptors, your smell receptors in there. Vitamin D is another one that people will claim is a super immune booster. And there are some studies that suggest that it may help in the immune system and fighting off viruses. But for the most part, if you're able to be outside for 10 minutes or so, your body actually makes vitamin D in sunlight. So when you're outside in the sun, those UV rays actually stimulate your body to produce vitamin D. So if you get 10 minutes of sunshine and eat a relatively balanced diet, then you're getting all of the vitamin D that you need for normal function. There are not that many cases where you need to be taking like super vitamin D supplements. It's not going to help you super increase your immune system. And then we talked about allergies last time. They're that overreaction to fairly harmless antigens like pollen or mold or dust. So one thing that can happen in some people is that some people have what are called autoimmune disorders. And so this happens when your immune system fails to recognize certain cells as you. So even though they're Mr. Stanley cells, your immune system doesn't recognize them as Mr. Stanley cells and will attack certain types of cells. So things like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, multiple sclerosis, these are all diseases where your immune system is actually attacking your own body. Unfortunately, there's nothing that can be done to help cure this. It's not, obviously you can't take away your immune system because that would leave you vulnerable to any sort of disease. And there's no way for us to teach the immune system that these are actually human cells and they need to stop attacking it. But there are immune suppressant drugs which can help slow the progress of the disease and stave off some of the worst symptoms. I know there's a friend of mine who actually does have lupus, and whenever they get a flare-up of their disease, they describe it is that it usually attacks areas like joints and the ligaments in your joints between your bones. And they say that it makes them feel like a 90-year-old woman because all of a sudden they get, even though they're a fairly young person, they're in their mid-20s, they all of a sudden get extreme arthritis in their joints, and it becomes very painful for them to move around until their flare-up passes. And then cancer, we talked about a little bit last time as well. So cancer is not actually an invasion of foreign cells into you, but instead, it's when your normal human cells start dividing out of control. So normally there's a specific and controlled way by which your cells divide and make more of themselves, but cancer happens when too much division occurs. These cells keep dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing, and they won't stop. It causes all sorts of different problems for the body because those cells start draining resources. They start developing their own arteries and veins to help keep themselves going. And they can start shutting down body organs if those cells end up dividing too much and causing tumors that start interfering with your body functions. So those T cells, those killer T cells, some of them can recognize and destroy these cancer cells, even though it started off as a Mr. Stanley cell or as a MAT cell. Your killer T cells are able to say, this is wrong, this is bad, and we need to take out these cells. Unfortunately, the reason why this doesn't cure everybody of cancer is that a lot of times the cancer cells are dividing too fast for the T cells to take them out. So there's some research going on that's looking into helping our T cells recognize and destroy the cancer cells earlier and more quickly. In AIDS, we talked about last time, instead of being an autoimmune disorder, it's an acquired immune disorder or immune deficiency. And it's when the HIV, I keep wanting to say the HIV virus, even though that's redundant because HIV means human immunodeficiency virus. So HIV attacks and destroys helper T cells. And so because it destroys these T cells, it makes it harder for the rest of the immune system to find them because all these lost T cells would normally be able to detect this virus. And it means that any other infections that occur over the course of somebody having AIDS makes it really difficult for your body to fight off other infections as well. So people first started recognizing the issue of HIV and AIDS when they noticed people dying from relatively mild or relatively rare diseases that most people's bodies would be able to fight off. So there's one specific type of infection that was really common in like really older men, like 80 to 90-year-old men, because obviously as you reach the end of your life, your immune system isn't quite as strong as it used to be. But they were finding this disease propping up in 20 and 30-year-old men who later they would realize were infected by HIV because their immune system had degraded to the point where it was like an 80 or 90-year-old's immune system and a 20 or 30-year-old person. So there's no cure for HIV technically because it's so difficult to fully get rid of it. There are a lot of drugs, a lot of like antiviral drugs that help to stop the reproduction of HIV, and so essentially stop it from infecting new T cells. And so it can severely slow down reproduction and allow people with AIDS to live a fairly normal and relatively non-immunocompromised life. But there's no total cure for HIV. There's no cure for there's no like vaccine or anything that people have been able to develop yet that'll fully get rid of the HIV virus once it's in there. right, and that, I believe, brings us to the end of the immune system. Mr. Matt, I believe you are the only one still in here with me at this point. So do you have any questions about anything? Anything that you want me to go back and talk about a little bit more?
Not really. I am kind of curious about one quick thing.
Sure.
The autism thing. I know it's not caused by, and this is totally random.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's a reason why the rates of it have gone up so dramatically in the last? Is it because we can recognize it more, or do you think there's something environmental that's causing so many more kids to have it now?
I think it's mostly the first one with a little bit of the second one. So I do think because autism is a lot more recognized as a legitimate mental health concern these days, that we are able to diagnose it a lot more often. People are much more familiar with the signs and symptoms of the autism spectrum. And so whereas before, people would either just think, oh, this person is like, oh, they're just really quirky, or oh, this person is just they're just a little bit slow, or like would call them like derogatory names like retard and stuff. Now we're able to say, no, there's actually this set of symptoms that are causing it, and so we're able to diagnose autism in people who may have gone undiagnosed if they lived 30, 40, 50 years ago.
That's indicative of the whole mental health field, though. But I was reading recently that schizophrenia has gone up in the last 10 years by about 70 to 80%. And that can't be just by diagnostic skills. Don't you think there's something in the environment that's spiking? Same with the depression and anxiety. Those went up 17, 18% in a 10-year period, which is a lot. But the schizophrenia one is scary because that's massive amounts of people with it now.
Yeah, that is a extremely significant increase. It is definitely likely that there's some sort of environmental trigger for it that wasn't around before. What exactly that is, whether it's due to air pollution in certain places or like water, like heavy metal contamination in water of certain areas due to industry and stuff like that. I don't really know exactly what might cause it, but I would definitely say that with an increase like that, it definitely would suggest that there's some sort of environmental contaminant that's having an effect on people as they develop.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I'm sorry, I know it's kind of off topic.
Oh, no, that's fine.
I'm really curious in that whole field.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I'm good.
All right, sweet. So let's see, the homework or the assignments for yesterday and today are pretty straightforward. Yesterday's was the one about the defenses, the different levels of defenses, and then today's was I think I asked about HIV and AIDS. Let's see, whole thing. So you're asking specifically about what does HIV target and how does that hurt the immune system? And so again, not too much details that I went over tonight are going to be really important for the homework or for the future exam. But I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail on a couple of those things that are important to know just from sort of just a general life standpoint. And because the immune system is really crazy and cool.
Very, very interesting.
Oh, yeah. Believe me, my wife would tell you all about it if she could.
I bet she's got a lot going on right now with Corona and whatnot.
So she actually, where she's working at now, she works for a clinical research lab, and I don't think that they're doing a lot of Corona testing, but she works for a company that essentially helps other companies put on their drug trials.
Oh, wow.
So she works at a company that'll test like some of the samples that they take from some of the different patients and provide like feedback on some of the different ways to produce some of the different medicines and vaccines and stuff. And so, yeah, she's all involved in the like healthcare field now, which is really cool because that's really what she was hoping to get into at some point.
Very.
All right. Then, like I said, the next week we're not going to be doing anything new. The final exam will be posted on Monday. It'll basically be set up just like the last one was, where you can do it on the Google form version in the different sections or on the Google Doc version. It'll be posted on Monday, due on Thursday, and cover everything from the whole term. Although I'd say it'll be about 50% new stuff. So it'll be like 50% of, probably even 50 to 60% of muscular system, skeletal system, excretory system, and immune system. And then 40 to 50% of digestion, circulation, respiratory, and nervous system. And so we'll cover kind of everything that we've talked about so far in class on Tuesday and Thursday in really brief kind of segments, just to give everybody a quick little reminder of some of that stuff that we talked about way back in early September.
Sounds good.
All righty.